All right, we're going to start this third module. Really, the second chapter in your book, or it's talking about Mesopotamia and Persia. Uh, this is where civilizations really get a kickstart. Right? In the prehistoric unit, we didn't really have enough knowledge to say that this is where people were living and gathering and building structures, right? Like a society being formed, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But in Mesopotamia, we see that. And so this is really what we consider the very first and sort of the launching point of all culture and civilizations from here on out. It's like we kind of mark Mesopotamia and this area in the Middle East as the beginning. And so to show you what we're talking about, right, and what is known as that Fertile Crescent is, this area right here in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and it actually continues. You can see that other rivers continue all the way up into Turkey, up in here. So you have a lot of early developments all up in this area, a lot of small little tribes that form. And Mesopotamia is talked a lot about in a few writings, including biblical, and in there, that's where we hear about a lot of different tribes. We hear a lot about different people and customs and what's going on there, as really the first major civilizations and powers start coming together from these little isolated tribe groups. So Mesopotamia and Persia, these we're only talking about 3500 BCE. So in prehistoric times and Neolithic times, we're talking about thousands and thousands of years ago. But now we're really sort of getting closer into what we think of really like human development. And so what I'm talking about is sort of as this cradle of civilization is developing between the Tigris and Euphrates, we start to see laws come about. We start to see iconic buildings, temples, structures, right? Advancements in technology. All of that's coming out at this during this period. We're going to talk about the Sumerians first, them being the sort of the oldest, the earliest, and move into like the Persians and what we know a little bit about with them in this chapter. So, Sumerians. Sumerians are given their name because of the area Sumer, where in Mesopotamia, where a lot of the artifacts and stuff have originated from. So, this society really gave us some interesting ways of communication. I guess is the best way to say that. Is that they were the first known sort of way of communicating or writing, known as pictographs. Those pictographs would later become cuneiform, which is really the first system of writing, the first alphabetized writing. But pictographs, right, using pictures is sort of our oldest language. And to give you an idea of that, I want you to focus on what's called the Warkaves. And the YouTube link there will give you a 360-degree view of it. And it's very interesting because what we have established for the first time is sort of like a ground line. Now, in Western civilization, we love to sort of do things on like this grid-like format. And so we can see sort of our earliest roots right here when we look at sort of these ground lines, right? These bands that have separated each scene, almost like a graphic novel would be read. And as you turn this vase, you begin to see these scenes and how they sort of play out. Now, in this particular, we have a lot of like everyday life sort of scenes. It looks like potentially like a festival or an offering, right? Like people bringing goods. And so we could think that maybe this was ceremonial in nature. We see a lot of stylization about how things were being depicted, both plants, animals, and human beings. Now, what's kind of interesting about these human beings, when you look, it's like, well, this isn't just some naive approach, right? Look at, there's musculature that's going in on the figures. And with each one has been given, a different item to carry. Now, proportions and that, right? They're not there yet, but we can tell these are human beings. They are not sort of hyper stylized to leave us guessing that they would be something kind of like when we were talking about the Birdman cave drawings and such. These are just regular common people. And when we look at right up here, what's kind of interesting is we begin to see their use of trying to show space. Now, when you first look at it, like, oh, these things look like they're hanging up in the air or something. But imagine if this was something that's closest to you, and back there, by shifting its proportion or scale, now we're looking deeper into the composition. So by putting it up in the air, it's not necessarily just a wall hanging, but could be some idea of large item to a smaller item, and that distance between is supposed to give us a sense of space. So these are not just naive artists; they're really understanding sort of life around them and trying to depict that. Um, it'll take several centuries before we ever get into something that looks exactly like a true imitation of real life. You know, that realism is some of us like to call it. So but here's those pictographs, and now we have this way of learning. Even now, we can sit there and say, well, this is going to be about at least a certain set of tropes. So that's what's really important about this. Take a look at the video link as it gives you even more information. Okay. Now, I mentioned the second form of writing, which you'll need to know for a quiz and a test, is cuneiform. Cuneiform is a couple examples up there. I give you the alphabet that we know. We also have thousands of these little clay tablets. And so the idea is that when anything was recorded, they would just take a wooden wedge-shaped tool, stylus, and press it into this wet clay. That wet clay can be set in the sun, bada bing, you have this sort of dried out document. And we're not firing these things like we think of today with ceramics, but they do last, fairly long in just its format. But it could also then just be rehydrated and reused. What's really interesting about this is that if you had to guess why writing developed, think of some of the things you develop. Oh, okay, well, we wanted to develop writing because we wanted to maybe tell our history, or maybe we wanted writing developed because we loved graffitiing our names on walls. Whatever your sort of like idea of what really spawned writing. But what we do know is that the earliest forms of these cuneiform tablets, and the most common of them, are receipts, and receipts specifically for beer. So yes, if it wasn't for beer, we would not have had an organized system of writing. I know that sounds crazy, but at a time when fresh water was more scarce, right? The idea of putting grains and sort of having a lightly fermented drink secured the fact that that you weren't going to get giardia or other sort of parasites. So beer was commonly consumed, not like when we think of like the alcohol content that we have today, but a version of it was consumed, and people were paid in this. So as civilizations were and little societies were coming about, in order to really secure health, but then also have like some sort of monetary system before we had coinage and all that minted, people would work, and they would then be given a little clay tablet by kind of like imagine like the mayors going around and saying, oh yeah, no, they did their work, and they would put that into the clay, give that to the individual, and at the end of the day, when they were given that, they could go then to this station, and they could collect their beer ration for the day. And that clay tablet was showing that they did do what they say they did. So it's very interesting, and we know of their alphabet because of the Code of Hammurabi, but then also the Rosetta Stone, and the languages that have been put onto those tablets in 2 or 3 different forms, including Greek. So we've been able to get several variations. So we know how to read these things. So it's very important. with this, it wasn't just these receipts being written. There was also what's known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest stories of in human existence. It's sort of like your archetype hero and such, but it also has some interesting things, like it has the second narration of a flood story, right? We have that not only biblically, but we also have it in this Epic of Gilgamesh. And so I've provided for you, if you are interested in that story, sort of a quick little animation on the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's really interesting. It carries a lot of parallels to later stories as far as like Greek myths and such, but it is something that is sort of like the hierarchical literature from the Sumerians in the Mesopotamia area of the time. So now the cities. This is a very important um, sort of note. The cities themselves. It's funny because I put that old photo in the top right there, and they were just abandoned. I mean, what you're looking at there, people lined up sort of like in tourist fashion. Uh, and there was sort of like this, when you think of like movies like Indiana Jones and such, archaeology really sort of started to gain momentum again towards the end of the 1800s. And and so people were kind of wandering around looking for these places that either they had read about in like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or maybe they had read about biblically, or maybe that they had heard from nomad. I mean, and there was sort of this search for all these things ancient, and usually what it was is kind of a lot of amateurs, and they would find stuff, and then whatever they found, they would then of course send back to their country. Um, and some of it being treasures and all this sort of thing. So it was kind of also a way of getting rich. So it's not archaeology the way we think of in scholarly format, but these massive structures were just left out in the desert. So we they're sort of the interest in the research begins on them. And what you're looking at is an early ziggurat. Now, ziggurat really means stepped temple, right? And so the reconstruction photos here, and the last one is probably your best example. So we're looking at all three of these are the same. This is the reconstruction from here. So this is what was left. This was what was later sort of built back up in some entirety. But this is what it would have possibly looked like if it was all intact. Now, the reason why a lot of it's broken down is because of the type of bricks they use. There wasn't a strong understanding at this moment of like the firing process. So we're making bricks out of mud and straw and baking them in the sun, and then using those to create these, so they weather very easily, right? The moisture will still be able to get in. Now, luckily in these areas, there's probably a lot of sunny days, so it kept them strong. But then just over time, right, they get broken down. So that's why you're seeing such a level of decay, because they're not the type of bricks that we think of. But these ziggurats, there's some speculation into to really what they do. Uh, are I mean, everybody does agree that they were definitely a temple. This was not something that like a king would live in, and and when we think of it, you draw a lot of parallels to like Aztec or Mayan civilizations, and we'll eventually talk about those. But you can see sort of that same sort of like uh, system, that walkway up to the top, where you could imagine some sort of ceremony happening. Now we don't know. There were no real evidence of like human sacrifices or anything going on at these places. But we do know that there's some celestial alignments going on. So, as far as like being able to tell like where the sun sets or certain sunrise on certain days of winter and summer solstices. Um, but they do know that this upper chamber was probably held for a priest, and with that, this ceremony would happen. But these step pyramids, imagine imagine being sort of nomadic your entire life, and you come to a city the first time, and you're seeing a structure of that magnitude, that size. what is that going to tell you about the people that live there, right? It's going to show power, right? It's going to show that they are organized, they are financially backed, they have enough resources to uh, allow workers to do this and still survive, right? That nobody revolted or uprose on this. So these buildings, when you think about them, beyond their architecture, what do they symbolize at this time? So that's what I want you to sort of think about. But the step pyramid and this design is we're going to see this again and again and again. But ziggurat is one term that you will definitely need to know for a test. Okay, so the art that's being created. Um, there's a lot of conflicts that are going on as normally, like you would imagine. And, as far as like small tribes and families, and, and as they get bigger, right, more land may be needed or procured. So there's always sort of these rating. Well, eventually enough of these bands are either under one control or have group themselves together, that you have larger tribes. From tribes you get larger towns. From towns you're getting things like cities, and from cities you're getting different levels of power, right? So we have these conflicts, and they're definitely there is a lot of sort of like back and forth, right? There isn't necessarily a king that we see until we see this piece, right? And this is the victory stela of Naram-Sin. Now, stela um, is a stone slab, or stele, some call it. And they always narrate a scene, right? They're kind of like a commemoration stone, much like our tombstones. Now we have a very sophisticated arrangement of writing, so a tombstone now has more text than image on it. But you can imagine, to really commemorate something, carving it in stone, boy, there is no more permanent way. And what we see here, um, much like the Sumerians, we have this sort of flattened look of people, right? We're not looking at people in the full round. This is a relief carving on stone. So relief meaning just some of it is coming out that we can see. We also notice that there is still a stylization to people when we think of like sort of the proportions and what's going on here. Things look a little wonky. We definitely see a shift in scale, right? Here is the king. Boom. He's huge. Look at how he can walk over his enemies. He's literally stepping on them, and they are smaller. I mean, this one's even impaled by him, right? And so everything is sort of dwarfed in comparison. Now his warriors and followers, right, sort of marching behind him here, they don't even equal his stature. So that's how we can read these and start to understand, like, okay, this is what they're going to depict. But imagine, I mean, we can see sort of the movement happening as these what looks like ascending soldiers are climbing this mountain. And as they climb this mountain, they're conquering and stepping over everything as they go. And we have this person sort of pleading and for their life. We know because of the ceremonial headdress up here, right, the horns, that this is the king. And this is the first king. This is the king or this is the individual who unites all these tribes in this area and really forms, a larger cohesive Mesopotamia to really, we could start to use the word civilization. It's not just a little town anymore. Now, what's cool is we have sort of this mountain shape, right? The idea of a sacred mountain is something I want you to keep in your mind as we talk about it with architecture, especially like the ziggurat. We're going to see it again with different cultures and different religions. So this idea of a mountain, right, reaching the pinnacle, that the mountains must be sort of the ramp up to the gods. And that's what we're seeing here, is that it is sort of this anointing by God, or gods themselves. We have two stars or celestial bodies, almost look like eyes, right? And they are in ways here to say, like, yes, he has the power. He's God-like, right? So when we're looking at this, the form of this, the material, how the people are being depicted, right? The different sizes, proportions, scale, all of that is the form, right? The content, what is being depicted is this battle scene, And the meaning of it all is this rise to power. Okay, so if you had to talk about the form, the content, and the context of the piece, that's how you go about it. Now, the YouTube video gives you great more further background on this piece. It's gives you some different views too. It's a pretty large piece of stone. So, all right, the Code of Hammurabi, and you can see right down here all the little bit of text, and it's actually in a couple of languages. The Code of Hammurabi, you probably have heard of it. Maybe you've studied it before. It's a pretty elongated piece of stone that stands taller than it is wide. And at the very top is Hammurabi himself. He was a famous king of Babylon. And we see him here receiving laws from a god over here. So that once again, this idea of like, these didn't just come from my head, these came from on high, right? I have been given the power to interpret God, right? That's what these kings are pretty much saying. And on there is really our first recording of social order. You know, what is going to happen. So by writing down these laws, we truly have set in stone what the law and the punishment will be. So if you read through some of them, we know them as sort of like eye for an eye. But then there are some others that are sort of odd, you know, as far as like if you are guilty of beating your wife, then you must pay X amount of goats or something, you know, like that. Those sort of rules are on there, and that sits pretty hard with us today. But those sort of things are also on there. So there's some that are pretty like blatant, like okay, that makes sense, and then there's others that just as a Western civilization, and sort of I'd say the evolution that we have towards human rights, there's some rough ones to read. But if you want the full list, you can find that online. The YouTube video talks a little bit more about it. But what's visually interesting for us as artists is we see an attempt at foreshortening. And what I mean by that is we see it pretty stiff on all of them, right? We have that shoulder. On all the other images is that we had what we think of sort of as Egyptian too, where we see the one side of the body and that's it. But notice now how they're trying to incorporate the other side, right? We kind of get the idea that there's another shoulder over here. And especially with the godlike figure, right? They're turned and they're open to us, right? This arm is now coming back and this arm is coming forward. And it's a position that we can see. And that's what I mean by foreshortening, right? Is this distortion of an angle, right? Putting it at an angle. So now we're almost walking diagonally or being able to view diagonally into the subject instead of just seeing it as in that grid-like fashion. And so foreshortening, you'll need to know that term. And this is one of the earliest examples of this in art. Okay. Now, Babylon is known and famous for many things, and the YouTube link is really good about talking about this. Being, you know, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and it's the Ishtar Gates. When Babylon was sort of rediscovered and slowly dug away, they found a couple sets of these gates, and this is one, and it was found by a German archaeologist, and so he had it removed and sent back to Berlin. So this is actually in the Berlin Museum, and there were several sort of tiers of these gates to show, once again, that might and that power of Babylon. And the YouTube link also shows sort of a map and a layout of how these would have worked. There are some of these gates still in place, but what's very interesting about them is that they are glazed tiles that have been kind of mosaicked on top of that brick surface. And over here is actually a panel that says who did it. And it says, you know, that this was built by King Nebuchadnezzar. And, you know, another name that we linked biblically. But with having that panel on there, it has this sort of proof of now, you know, somebody signing it saying like, yeah, this was done. This was commissioned by. And
these wonders were written about even as time goes on. And I mentioned there in the notes by Cyrus of Persia, Alexander the Great, and then when the Arabic kingdom sort of rises, right? All of this was known to them and talked about. But these sort of tiles, what's really cool is that the animals themselves have a relief on them. I wish I had a better image to show you of this, but they stick out. So while the bluish color is flat, the tiles have been created in relief to stick out, and they are of creatures both real and fictitious, or whether they were created by an artist then are more stylized, but we see some different sort of animal representations that are happening there. So these are the main points that I want you to take away from this chapter. There's a lot. Please explore the videos. The videos give you a lot of insight to the sites and to other works that have been created that they do hold some importance, right? This is really the beginning where we start to formulate our ideas. And a lot of the stuff, even when I talk about the Code of Hammurabi, we can see still today that we carry with us. So it has major influence on us to this day.